Hello and welcome to Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on YouTube, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. And if you become a patron at any level, even if it's just $1, you can also hear the patron-only lectures. This will be Myth of the Month, number 26, The Industrial Revolution. And this is part 1, Conceiving a Catastrophe. And this is brought to you by the state of California. And this first part will be open to the public, and it will deal with how the idea first came about, that there was an industrial revolution in the 17 and 1800s. And I expect that soon I will make a second part, which will be on Patreon for patrons, which will deal with the controversies that have arisen as to whether the purported Industrial Revolution was a good thing or a bad thing, and more fundamentally, whether there actually was an Industrial Revolution at all. So this is a very big and complicated subject, and as I like to do sometimes, I want to start off just with a story. So in the year 1786, after much tinkering and many setbacks and missteps, the engineer James Watt and his business partner John Bolton opened the first ever steam-powered flour mill. It was designed by Scottish engineers who were operating at the cutting edge of metalworking, and it was sited in Suffolk on the south bank of the Thames River in London, just next to the Blackfriars Bridge. It was called the Albion Mills, invoking the ancient mythic term for England. It was about 6 stories high and a block long, looming over the riverbank with tiers of arched windows, and at the base a water gate opening directly onto the river. Crowds gathered to see the first demonstrations of the massive machinery. It was all driven by a single enormous Watt steam engine, which powered brass and cast iron rods and gears instead of the traditional wood which one had previously seen in flour mills. And these rods and gears in turn drove machines to lift sacks of grain off of the barges in the river, fan the grain to purify it, turn pairs of massive millstones to grind the grain, sift and dress the flour, and finally lower the finished sacks back into the barges. When in operation, it employed almost 500 people, and in time it became something of a tourist attraction, with many visitors, including artists, coming to see and hear the massive machinery, and to go up onto the roof to enjoy the panoramic view of the river and the booming city. In 1789, a second steam engine was installed, and together the two engines drove 20 pairs of millstones. Each pair could grind about 9 bushels of flour per hour, adding up to a total output of 180 bushels per hour, far outstripping any previously existing mill complex in England. But the operation was extremely expensive to build and to maintain, and it was barely turning a profit. Also, by 1790, it seems it was controversial. Accusations surfaced that managers were using imported foreign grain rather than domestic English crop, that they were adulterating the grain with potato flour, that they were hoarding stock to manipulate the market and boost prices. Now, all of these rumors were probably false, but also more substantively, there were complaints that the operation was monopolizing the large flour market around England and putting traditional windmills around the city out of business. Early in the morning of March 2nd, 1791, a fire broke out in the mill. It spread at lightning speed. Crowds quickly gathered along the street and the Blackfriars Bridge to watch the spectacle and to see the fire brigade struggling to contain the fire. But it was futile. The fire completely gutted the building within about 2 hours, and then it spread to neighboring houses before it was finally contained. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, a flurry of popular prints and broadsides were published, depicting the conflagration, the fire brigades, and the crowds of gawkers against the backdrops of the city and the Thames. In 2 of these prints, one can see devil figures holding bellows and fanning the flames as the crowds look on, and in one case, the crowd seemed to cheer. The owners of the mill suspected arson, and they demanded an inquest, but engineers soon concluded that a lack of lubrication on bearings had led to overheating and then to an explosion. Wheat flour dust is known to be explosive. After the furor eventually died down, the burned-out husk of the mill remained standing on the riverbank next to the heavily trafficked bridge. For about 18 years, thousands of Londoners would have seen the ruins every day, before the empty shell of the building was finally torn down in 1809. Among those who surely would have seen the ruins was the poet William Blake, who lived for 9 years in Lambeth, in London, not far to the southwest, and he would likely have crossed over Blackfriars Bridge whenever he traveled into the city of London. In 1808, while the burnt-out mill was still standing, Blake published a long philosophical poem about John Milton, which is not his most celebrated work. But in the preface to this long epic on Milton, Blake included a short, untitled 16-line poem, which is conventionally referred to by its opening line, "And did those feet in ancient time." The subject of this short poem was the long-standing folk legend, which held that in the Roman era, Christ's early follower, Joseph of Arimathea, had traveled to Britain and introduced the early primitive church into the island. The first 2 stanzas of this poem consist of a series of rhetorical questions. Quote, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here, among these dark satanic mills?" End quote. This short poem captured the popular imagination more than almost any other of Blake's works. During World War I, it was set to music under the title Jerusalem, and it has become a classic British patriotic anthem. Now, this makes a certain amount of sense, since the early stanzas of the poem set forward an idea of England being divinely chosen and blessed, fated to be a kind of new Holy Land, despite its great distance from the original Jerusalem. And then the later stanzas have a rousing martial cast, calling the audience to arms to create and defend this new Jerusalem. And they contain the famous phrase, "chariots of fire," which also has entered the English language. So the poem and the song are naturally beloved of devout Christians, especially in England, and patriotic nationalists. It's also beloved of many leftists who see this prophesied New Jerusalem as a social utopia. But probably no phrase in the poem, or in all of Blake's copious works, has attracted more interest and more debate than the brief reference to these dark satanic mills. Now, naturally, many have pointed out that at the time that Blake was writing in the early 1800s, actual water-driven and steam-driven mills were springing up all over Britain, and they were bringing pollution, fires, accidents, and masses of immiserated workers in their wake. Hence, it's supposed surely this is what Blake had in mind when he invoked these dark satanic mills. And others have pointed more specifically to the Albion Mills in London, the destruction of which Blake supposedly must have witnessed. And further, some have even pointed out the devil figures in the prints that depicted the fire, hence the association of this mill with Satan. Now, there is no direct evidence showing that Blake actually did see the fire that destroyed the Albion Mills. He may have, though by proximity in time and space, he probably did see the burned-out shell of the building, which stood for 18 years. And whether or not he saw any of these prints or heard stories placing the devil at the scene of the accident, that is anyone's guess. But this story, in one version or another, has entered into conventional wisdom. It is widely understood that Blake was witnessing the rapid industrialization of England and its marring of the idyllic countryside and its physical and spiritual immiseration of the folk. And in his works, he was crying out against this change, calling for a return to spiritual roots. Hence, this prefatory poem, or even Blake's entire oeuvre, can be taken as a critique of the Industrial Revolution. And part of why this story, this narrative of William Blake seeing the fire and the ruins on the Thames and writing about dark satanic mills, part of why this story is so powerful and enduring is that it seems to capture in miniature the whole idea of the Industrial Revolution. We have a group of businessmen and engineers setting up a massive factory which is spectacular, stunningly productive, and yet also sinister, and also ultimately essentially hollow, going up in flames after only 5 years and leaving behind an eerie shell. The whole episode seems to encapsulate the sense of the Industrial Revolution as a historic episode. Rapid, dramatic, cataclysmic, driven by practical genius, ambition, and recklessness, coinciding remarkably in time with the French Revolution, which was in full swing across the Channel, and finally unfolding too fast for anyone to take stock of, except for poets, coming along and surveying the wreckage years later. And even Blake's poem, when seen in light of this purported link to the Albion Mills, named after the mythic version of England, Albion, which Blake invoked many times, even this poem can be seen as reflecting the sort of inner nature of the Industrial Revolution, which is a world-altering phenomenon with deep metaphysical implications that is at the same time deeply tied to the landscape of England. So this gives, I think, just a little touchstone to help grasp the subtle powers of the myth of the Industrial Revolution. And this phrase is deeply embedded in the English language, and it's found in most English language dictionaries. And before we look at how it's defined in a supposedly technical sense, we have to note the strong connotations that come with this phrase. It calls up images of crowded factories and steam locomotives sounding their whistles, miners with headlamps, and giant chimneys belching smoke. It's almost a cliché scene. But also, like some other mythic phrases that we've discussed in historian-splaining, the term can sound as if it has a precise technical definition. It's these two long Latinate words, which are rather scientific sounding, and it seems to imply a parallel to other discrete historical events, like the French Revolution, which can be clearly dated in time and space. And hence it seems that the Industrial Revolution should also constitute a clear, identifiable event in history. But under some examination, the concept can be seen to be highly ambiguous, squishy, and fungible. There is no clear consensus as to precisely what it was, when it supposedly began or ended, or even whether it ended at all. And hence there is a huge gap between the perception of the concept's precision and the reality with regard to this phrase. Now, of course, we could just, go to a dictionary. But if one looks into these dictionaries, one can find a certain degree of confusion and ambiguity. Most of all, ambiguity as to whether the phrase refers to an actual specific historical event which happened in a particular place and time. You can call this the capitalized form. Capital I, capital R, Industrial Revolution. And this form assumes a parallel to other historical revolutions, like the French or Russian revolutions. Or, on the other hand, does it refer to a type of economic change which can happen anywhere in the world at any time? You could call this the lowercase form of the phrase. Now, many dictionary definitions do not distinguish between these two different usages, and instead they try to somehow mash these two meanings together, such as by suggesting that the Industrial Revolution is an ongoing global phenomenon which nonetheless originated in or centered on Great Britain. But the relationship between the two, between the localized British Revolution and the broader global change, is often ambiguous, leading to long, vague, or unwieldy definitions with lots of hedging. For example, if we look in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is American, it defines Industrial Revolution as, quote, a rapid major change in an economy, as in England in the late 18th century, marked by the general introduction of power-driven machinery or by an important change in the prevailing types and methods of use of such machines, end quote. So you can see here the idea is presented as fundamentally abstract and transferable to any place in the world. Anywhere that has an economy and where either people take up the use of these machines or they change in some way how they use these machines, this place could have an industrial revolution. And you might note these sorts of changes take place all the time in countries all around the world. The specific reference here to England in the late 18th century is slipped in parentheses, and it is framed as just one example, as in, not as the center or origin point of this change. And perhaps the lexicographers at Merriam-Webster just had to squeeze in this reference to England because that is in fact the time period and the country that the term is so closely tied to in the popular mind. They couldn't really leave it out, but they also don't split it off into its own separate definition. So the dictionary is trying here, I would say, to smooth over a wide gap between how the phrase is usually used by scholars and how it is used by the wider public. Most other definitions, too, show a kind of ambivalence, suggesting that the writers know that most people, when they use the phrase, are thinking of the Industrial Revolution as a singular event in time, which either happened in Britain or began in Britain, and which marked a total change in society. But at the same time, these writers know that scholars today do not see it that way, and they instead have stretched the meaning out and abstracted it to refer to endless industrial revolutions in different countries or to many successive transformations, like the so-called Second Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s, or some others to Third and Fourth Industrial Revolutions. And pundits today go even further, referring to future changes as, quote, the next industrial revolution. So there is a tension here, and hence scholarship for popular consumption, not just dictionaries, but encyclopedias, documentaries, articles in the popular press. This sort of scholarship basically hedges and tries to have it both ways, or really to have it multiple ways, somehow putting the different meanings of the phrase together into a blender and grinding them up and hoping that the mixture comes out okay. And what you come out with ultimately is a kind of confused and unwieldy mythic narrative, which is hard to summarize, but I would try to sum it up as something like this, right? When people talk about the Industrial Revolution, they're thinking about a story that goes something like this. It all started in England, which was rural and agrarian and basically still medieval, until around 1760, when someone made a spinning jenny or a spinning mule or something spinning, and then it all took off from there. Suddenly they started making things with machines instead of by hand, because of course looms and forges and spinning wheels aren't really machines, but mules and jennies are. And once they had those jennies spinning, before you knew it, they were industrialized. Everyone left the farms and crowded into factories. Suddenly there were kids in coal mines and locomotives crashing into steel mills, and Charles Dickens was creating Scrooge. And then once they had all this industry going on in England, everybody else got jealous, and so they copied it in Europe and America and Asia, and now everybody's industrialized, and everyone's driving cars to work and buying machine-made shirts and voting for centrist parties. That is, except for those of us who aren't industrialized, who are basically still living in the Dark Age. So this story, as I've put it forward, is not exactly false, but it's not exactly true either. Like most myths, it's an oversimplified story, with parts that are false and parts that are just arbitrary or circular, basically meaningless. And this story was created to serve certain political ends, and it's been revised and adapted over time to further different political needs. So to show what I'm saying, let's go back again and look at other examples of formal definitions and see if we get anything better. So another example definition from Encyclopedia Britannica, so this is a British source, has 3 sentences, and it reads, quote, Industrial Revolution. In modern history, the process of change from an agrarian and handicraft economy to one dominated by industry and machine manufacturing. These technological changes introduced novel ways of working and living and fundamentally transformed society. This process began in Britain in the 18th century and from there spread to other parts of the world. End quote. So there's a lot going on in this definition, but just to lay out the basics, this definition involves a narrative, and this narrative has two dimensions to it. For one, it's a story of movement from one sphere to another. So changes begin with technology, but they then transform all of society. And secondly, it's a story of geographic location. This process began in Britain and then spread elsewhere. So thus far, this seems straightforward enough. But it's important to note some elements embedded in this definition. For one, it asserts the basic notion of industry. So this story involves a change in the economy from agriculture and handicrafts to so-called industry. Now, this would have made no sense to people in the actual time period when this industrial revolution supposedly happened in the 1700s to early 1800s. At that time, industry was most often used to mean work or labor or the quality of being hardworking. Industry was most fundamentally a virtue of character. It was not technological. People in farming and handicrafts were just as industrious as anybody else. And it was also not something new. And some commentators even said that it was declining, that industry was going downhill from where it had been before. Only very gradually did people start to use the word industry to mean productive activities, specifically processing raw materials into consumer products, like in the paper-making industry or the glass-making industry. And even still, at this point in the 19th century, even still, the term was not particularly tied to machines. There was no separation between so-called handicrafts and labor involving machinery like water mills or steam engines. So long-standing, even ancient crafts like weaving and winemaking were still called industries. And it's only even later, in the later 1800s, when people start talking about the so-called Industrial Revolution, that they then invent this new, narrower meaning of industry as denoting only mechanized production using non-human power, like water mills or steel mills or coal-fired power plants. So hence, we're seeing circular reasoning here, using the concept of industry as distinct from handicrafts in order to define the Industrial Revolution is actually circular. In other words, the Industrial Revolution was the transition from farming to industry, and industry is the sort of stuff that started in the Industrial Revolution. Now, secondly, if we look at the way time works in Britannica's definition, there's an odd slippage about time. So the first sentence of the definition has no tense because it has no verb. The Industrial Revolution is just, quote, the process of change attached to no particular time. Then in the second sentence, we get the past tense, technological changes introduced and transformed. So is this a singular event that happened in the past and is now finished, or is it still ongoing? As usual, this is left vague and undetermined in this definition. And we get an order of causation. The technology changed, and that then wrought a transformation of everything else, or society, basically everything people do in a particular place. And this tends to be spelled out pretty explicitly in most definitions. Technological changes happen or happened, and then those changes reverberate and transform everything around them. And even the specific word transform or transformation appears in almost every definition that you can find. So one can't really say precisely when this changeover happened, but we can say that it completely changed everything. And this further implies a kind of materialist version of history, where the economy or technology drives society. It is the base, and everything else going on in society is a sort of superstructure operating on that base. Hence, when material production changes, all of society changes. And you can further extrapolate, since this happened in Britain, then surely the same transformation must be reproduced in other countries when the process of the Industrial Revolution spreads abroad. Hence why today we talk about industrialized and not yet industrialized countries. So all in all, we can say this definition from Britannica has a lot of ambiguity and slippage, and it carries a lot of hidden implications about how history and society work. And it's probably like this because it is trying to boil down in an ultra-compact form a myth which does not have a fixed, consistent form. So just to look briefly at some other definitions for what they can give us, which I called from History.com, EBSCO, and National Geographic. These also use a lot of hedging words like largely or especially to try to square the circle. Is the Industrial Revolution a period, an event, a process, or something else? Is it local or global? When did it start? When did it end? Or did it end at all, or is it still happening? Did it change everything, or just particular industries? What caused the change? Was it technology or something else? Did it have no specific cause at all? So I could easily comb through each of these definitions one by one, picking apart how they are vague or contradictory, but I will spare you that, and I'll try to just briefly point out a few important repeating points. So for one, these definitions and summaries cannot make up their minds as to when the Industrial Revolution actually happened. The chronology is all over the map. As for when it began, they'll say the 1700s, the early 1700s, the mid-1700s, 1750, 1760, the 1780s, or even later, after 1800, 1815, the 1830s. And History.com, on their page, they go beyond just vagueness and ambiguity, and they actively contradict themselves. So in their definition, they say that the Industrial Revolution was, quote, a period of scientific and technological development in the 18th century, meaning the 1700s. So that's their initial definition. Then just a few lines down, they say, quote, though a few innovations were developed as early as the 1700s, the Industrial Revolution began in earnest by the 1830s and 1840s, end quote. Well, hold on here. You just said a moment ago that it took place in the 1700s. Then a couple of lines later, you're downplaying everything that happened in the 1700s. It was just a few innovations. And now asserting instead it did not begin in earnest, whatever that means, until much later. And even then, after all of this hedging and caveating, you still can't even pick a decade. You say by the 1830s or 1840s. So I'm imagining here how confused I would be if I was a school kid and I was looking to this site just to get some basic clear facts. Similarly, EBSCO, an American publisher that supplies libraries in the United States, they also have a page on the Industrial Revolution. And there they say, quote, the Industrial Revolution, primarily occurring in the late 18th to early 19th century, marked a significant transformation in manufacturing processes and economic structures, first in Britain and later in the United States and other developed nations. So for this one, EBSCO at least does not contradict itself, but they throw out a very broad, vague period, covering as much as a century, the late 18th to early 19th centuries. Then, even still, they cannot commit to saying that it actually took place within that stretch of time. They hedge and just say it primarily occurred in that stretch of time. So this naturally raises questions. Are you saying it was even longer than that? Did it begin even earlier? Did it end even later? Does it even have a beginning or end? Apparently not. And truly, most definitions won't even tell you when this supposed transformation ended or whether it ended at all. This seems to be a kind of sore subject. Most often they talk about how industry spread beyond Britain to America or other locales, and then they just sort of trail off without clarifying whether this revolution was ever completed or not, or how you would even know if it was. Now, to look again at EBSCO, they go on to say that, quote, in the U.S., early innovations in the textile industry, particularly in New England, were foundational to this shift, paving the way for later advancements, often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution, around 1870, end quote. So this can seem fair enough as it goes. But EBSCO puts this phrase, second industrial revolution, into scare quotes, as if they are unwilling to commit to the idea that this second wave of change really happened, or that it is a valid historical category. They're sort of keeping it at arm's length. But this then raises the further question: if this idea of a second industrial revolution around 1870 is so shaky or questionable that you have to put it into scare quotes, then what about the original, more basic idea of the Industrial Revolution as such? Well, when it comes to this second industrial revolution, at least you have a reasonably precise date, circa 1870. Whereas when it comes to the original event, nobody can even seem to settle on a century when it happened. So this raises the question then, why aren't we at least equally skeptical as to whether there was an industrial revolution in the first place? Or at least question whether it constituted a distinct, dramatic transformation, as all of these definitions keep saying. Well, almost as if reading our minds and anticipating this very question, National Geographic has posted a page as well about the Industrial Revolution. And theirs begins, quote, "The Industrial Revolution deserves the name with which historians have tagged it," end quote. And you can see, having looked through everything we already have, this line sounds almost defensive, as if they're saying, don't you dare doubt the dramatic and hyperbolic terms that we use to describe this very broad, vague time period. It's totally real and totally a big deal, capital B, capital D. And National Geographic then goes on to use this same term that basically every definition of the Industrial Revolution that you will ever find anywhere always uses: transformation. This is the great common denominator. The Industrial Revolution transformed things. But National Geographic does at least put some more meat on the bones than most others do. They get into some of the substance of this supposed historical rupture. What exactly changed? And they write, quote, "It brought about thorough and lasting transformations, not just in business and economics, but in the basic structures of society. Before industrialization, when the most significant economic activities in most European countries were small-scale farming and artisan handicrafts, social structures remained essentially as they had been during the Middle Ages. The advent of industrial development revamped patterns of human settlement, labor, and family life. The changes set in motion by industrialization ushered Europe, the United States of America, and much of the world into the modern era." End quote. So this can be seen as a stronger and more uncompromising statement, but it also repeats a lot of similar themes to the others. This revolution started in Britain, then leapt to America, and then to the rest of the world. And it brought about a transformation. This transformation is total and all-encompassing, including business, economics, labor, the family, and the so-called basic structures of society. Thus, the basic takeaway that we can gather from comparing all of these definitions and summaries of the Industrial Revolution is that we can't really say when it began or ended, or whether it ended at all, but we do know that it totally changed everything. In this way, it serves as a convenient catch-all explanatory mechanism. Whatever this revolution is or was, it is the one big explanation for why everything is the way it is today in our modern world. And more specifically, this National Geographic page is a bit more explicit than some other definitions we've seen in describing the nature of this social transformation. Namely, it marked the shift from the Middle Ages to the modern era, from medieval life to modernity. And when trying to give specific substance to this change, National Geographic describes it as the shift from rural to urban. That much is pretty common and standard in popular writings about the Industrial Revolution. But in explaining the great importance of these shifts, it goes even further in describing how backwards and antiquated the pre-industrial world was, i.e., social structures were basically unchanged since the Middle Ages. So this implies then that there had been no great fundamental change in society between the Middle Ages and the mid 1700s, when ostensibly the Industrial Revolution began. This means then that the Reformation, the Enclosure Movement, the English Civil War and Interregnum, the creation of overseas colonies, and the Glorious Revolution, all of this really didn't matter. At root, things remained the same. And presumably they remained fundamentally the same because they were still rural and agrarian. And when things are rural and agrarian, then they're basically medieval. All of these things are just synonymous, and they all spell continuity, a world where nothing changed, just landlords and their peasants bound to the land, raising their animals and laboring in fields season after season, with no prospect of change or threat of disruption. So this is very significant. Many scholars who have written on the Industrial Revolution have basically shared this assumption, that pre-industrial society was stable, unchanging, and medieval or feudal. Marx argues that each era of history is defined by an economic mode of production, and the one that preceded industrialism was feudalism. And he further argues that industrial capital overthrew the old feudal order. In fact, it was the only thing that could. And early on, many theorists who wrote about the Industrial Revolution around Marx's time and later, they viewed that old pre-industrial order through an idealizing lens, seeing stability, tradition, material security, and closeness to nature. Others later saw something a bit different, stagnation, stifling poverty, and ignorance. But all agree in seeing a lack of change, a kind of world locked in amber which nothing could shake until suddenly industry arrived. So then the question here is not how did industrialization show up and disturb the apple cart? Rather, it is how did people come to see things this way? How did all of these changes, like the Reformation, the Great Witch Hunt, peasant rebellions, the rise of world trade and colonization, civil wars and revolutions, how did all of these events of the early modern age get swept aside in favor of the idea that one great upheaval, a purported industrial revolution in the 17 and 1800s, disrupted the old world and gave birth to modernity? Okay, so let's talk about the genesis of this myth. And the first big important fact that we have to note, which could be said to be an irony, is the total absence of reference to any so-called industrial revolution in the exact place and time where it supposedly happened. So the Industrial Revolution, according to every definition, began in Great Britain, and more specifically in England. And it began sometime between the early 1700s and the early 1800s. By 1840, it was definitely well underway, or even completed, depending on whom you ask. Yet, all through that era, nobody in England ever used the phrase Industrial Revolution. They talked sometimes about industry in a broad sense, and sometimes about industrial progress to mean adoption of new technologies to increase production. But somehow this whole revolution and the total transformation that it brought about went unnoticed and unremarked by the very people who lived through it. Now, to be precise, the first known appearance of the phrase Industrial Revolution in English did not appear until 1848. And even then, as we'll see when we look at that, even here, it definitely did not refer to changes that had just happened or were in process of happening in England. It took until even later, after 1870, for some people in Britain to begin speaking of an industrial revolution having taken place in that country. And even then, it was really only spoken of within a rarefied avant-garde intellectual circle. The phrase did not enter into broader usage among the literate until after 1880, and it didn't reach a broader popular consciousness and really enter into the everyday language until after 1900. So what does this mean? Well, Britons were either extraordinarily oblivious to how their own world was being transformed around them, or they did not experience economic and technological change in anything like the way that the myth of the Industrial Revolution assumes. Now, some people might already be objecting and saying this is not true. Britons might not have used the exact phrase, but surely Britons were aware of how their world was rapidly changing and getting busier and grimier and more industrial. Specifically, some might think, weren't those romantic poets going on about the pristine English countryside being marred by these dark satanic mills? And this is certainly one of the things that came to my mind when I decided to address the subject of the Industrial Revolution. And in truth, that one line from that one poem by William Blake has been forced to bear an enormous amount of weight in supporting the notion that Britons in the early 1800s were cognizant of the booming of heavy industry and saw it in a negative light as destroying the English landscape. And personally, I believe I remember seeing that line specifically cited in a textbook in my high school education in the United States. Now, as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, this line comes from a short, untitled 4-stanza poem that the mystical poet William Blake wrote sometime between 1804 and 1808 when it was published. And in this poem, as we saw, Blake invokes the story of Joseph of Arimathea supposedly visiting England and planting Christianity there. And Blake uses this story to advocate that Britain ought to be a so-called New Jerusalem, or an ideal primitive Christian utopia. But now we must ask, does the poem really have anything to do with the Albion Mills or with the Industrial Revolution? As far as I can see, Blake never made any explicit reference in any of his copious writings to the Albion Mills. And although he was a prolific printmaker, he did not contribute anything to the flurry of prints depicting the Albion Mills fire in 1791. And this interpretation that the line in the poem Dark Satanic Mills refers to an actual modern-day steam-driven mill seems to ignore or even contradict the context of the poem. So if we look at the poem's first 2 stanzas, which I read earlier, they set up a contrast between England's brightest features and qualities and her darkest. On the one hand, the green mountains and pastures, and on the other, clouded hills and dark satanic mills. So one can take this, as some interpreters do, one can take this as setting up a contrast between the rural and pastoral on the one hand, and the modern and industrial on the other. But we have to note the poem does not actually say that. The darker side includes clouded hills, which are not urban or modern or industrial. They're just a darker aspect of precisely the same landscape. So the dark side here is just as inherent in the land as the light side. It's a spiritual contrast. Dark and light are 2 sides of the same coin. And one might be tempted to think specifically that the dark satanic mills represent an intrusion of modernity. And of course, the phrase easily calls to mind paintings of huge towering factory smokestacks belching out soot and glowing molten metal being poured out of hellish-looking furnaces. And I think that's where I first saw it, was next to a textbook illustration like that. But if you actually read the poem, the mills are placed in the ancient past, just like all the other images of England. The poem is set up by a rhetorical question expressing disbelief that the divine presence of Christ's disciple, or Christ himself, could have possibly set foot in such a dark, fallen, imperfect place as Britain. And the phrase in question appears in the past tense. And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? And the mere word mills does not necessarily refer to a modern industrial factory. Mills as such are not a modern thing. They've been around for millennia. The ancient Romans built large complexes of watermills. Windmills were invented and became widespread in the High Middle Ages, used to drive millstones or bellows for forges. And William Blake, if he saw water-driven textile mills in his time, he did not necessarily see them as representing modernity as opposed to the past. And that is assuming that Blake meant the line to refer to actual literal mills. Now, one could still object at this point by pointing to those two prints depicting the burning of the Albion Mills in 1791, where we see devil figures present. But in fact, in those prints, the devil figures are not associated with the mill, but rather with the fire. In one of them, he is seen pumping a bellows into the window to help fan the flames. So, in these conventional images from 1791, the mill is not cast as satanic, but rather the fire destroying it is. In fact, the notion of mills being somehow satanic seems to be unique and original to Blake, and it's rooted in his complicated and distinctive mystical cosmology. So, as other literary scholars have pointed out, in the body of the poem on Milton, Blake refers to mills in a very abstract, mystical sense as some sort of invisible force or machine, as in, quote, "the starry mills of Satan are built beneath the earth and waters of the mundane shell," end quote. So they're not even earthly things. And further, some have argued that the phrase that we see, dark satanic mills, might refer to the established Anglican Church, which Blake saw as basically evil and corrupting. Also, I would note in his poem, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake seems to combine the two possible meanings of mills, as satanic and ecclesiastical. So in this poem, the narrator describes being visited by an angel who takes him out and guides him on a spiritual outing. And the narrator says, quote, "He took me through a stable and through a church and down into the church vault, at the end of which was a mill. Through the mill we went and came to a cave," end quote. And there the narrator and the angel seem to see a kind of vision of hell. So in this story, the mill appears as a kind of underground threshold linking the church and the underworld. Hence, regular old mills seem to hold, not modern industrial mills, but just ordinary mills, seem to hold a peculiar spiritual and otherworldly significance for Blake. And there is no necessary reason to think that these satanic mills in his famous poem refer to the Albion flour mills, nor to any other modern industrial mills. And really, in general, the notion that contemporaries perceived or commented on an industrial revolution taking place in their own time does not bear up to scrutiny. Contemporary laypeople, artists, and poets did not generally perceive industrial ventures like textile mills or ironworks as marking some dramatic break with the past or as transforming their entire world. Now, you might note some later British Romantic writers, such as Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin, did bemoan the spiritual hollowness of modern industrial Britain. But they contrasted it with the Middle Ages, which they saw as more Christian, more humane, and more heroic. And they did not put forward any theory as to how or why Britain had been industrialized. They did not claim that there had been any sudden dramatic changeover to industrialism, much less a revolution in their own lifetimes. And even Carlyle, probably the most stridently anti-modern of these British romantics, Carlyle actually hoped, ironically, that captains of industry, and he coined that phrase, that captains of industry would lead a moral revival and create a modern chivalry of work. And thus old moralized social relations could be revived within the modern framework. So they don't see any definite binary opposition between pre-industrial and industrial. Now, as for scholars at the time, like historians and political economists in the 17 and 1800s, they did write quite a bit about industry and about industrial progress. And a few texts even mentioned industrialism, but none of them ever considered that they were seeing an industrial revolution. They didn't see industry as something new or as something driving a grand transformation in life or society. Rather, that phrase, industrial revolution, and the concept behind it, had to come to them much later from the continent, from French and especially German writers. So why is that? Why is there this difference between Britons and people on the continent? Why were the British so obtuse, you might ask? Maybe in part it's just easier to perceive changes from a distance as opposed to when you're in the middle of them. But there are definite ideological factors as well. So Britons, French, and Germans saw history very differently in this age. The conventional wisdom in Britain in the 1700s and early 1800s was basically Whig history. And that's something I talked about way back in the first lecture in this series, in The Myths We Make. Whig history was the reigning philosophy in Britain. And this is more or less the idea that the struggle for liberty is the main driver of history. And more specifically, that this ideal of liberty had been almost perfectly realized in Britain. This was a free Protestant country with a body of common law and a perfectly balanced government, with a limited constitutional monarchy and a strong parliament. Whigs generally do not like revolutions. They are too disruptive and they endanger liberty. They are the sort of thing that hot-headed French people do. They are thoroughly unnecessary in Britain. And you might know this is more or less what Edmund Burke argued, right? His reflections on the revolution in France are basically just a statement of standard Whig history. So to a British Whig, the last revolution that actually mattered or was necessary was the so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688. So this was the coup d'etat, which established the rules of the Protestant succession and the Bill of Rights. And according to a Whig, after that, no more revolutions are necessary. Government and society have been perfected, and the rest is just tinkering around the edges. For example, if you think of the great classic of Whig history, which is Catherine Macaulay's History of England, she wrote this book in the 1780s, and it ends with the Glorious Revolution in 1688 to 89. And reportedly, she intended at some point to go up just to the accession of the Hanover dynasty in 1714 as a kind of epilogue, but she never got around to it, right? The last event that really matters is the Glorious Revolution, and basically Whigs saw that as the end of history. So the basic assumption underlying all of this is that revolutions are fundamentally a political matter. Worldly changes, like in economic arrangements, flow from and are delimited by politics. Right? The driver is politics, government, the Constitution, society flows from that. So time and the ages of history are determined by the reigns of kings and the sessions of parliaments. Now, by contrast, in this same period, if we're talking about, our supposed industrial revolution era, late 1700s and early 1800s, in this same period, the French were much more free in talking about revolutions. The French Constitution was repeatedly changing from 1789 onwards. There was no entrenched assumption that the state had reached its final and perfected form in France. Nor was there even an underlying prior assumption that there was some single unifying driver of history, like the quest for liberty. Hence, there was no clear way to know when history was finished. It was understood that more revolutions were still possible. Now, still, this does not necessarily mean that people in France would see changes in industry as a revolution. This notion surfaced only gradually, and it began, it seems, as a metaphor or figure of speech, not as a theory of history. So all of the earliest uses of the phrase industrial revolution are in French. And it starts early on, near the beginning of the 19th century, really just in the aftermath of the French Revolution. So at this time, French writers and orators began to use the word revolution to describe changes and innovations in industry. For example, in 1804, two chemists published a book called Elements of the Art of Dyeing, and that's dyeing like dyeing textiles. And the context was that they were celebrating the fact that textile workshops and factories were then starting to employ trained scientists as advisors to improve their chemical techniques. And they wrote that this expert chemical knowledge was necessary to, quote, provoke progress in the useful arts. So it's noteworthy that they are still using this term art to refer to manufacturing, something we would today call industry. And so in this context, they wrote, quote, une heureuse révolution s'est opérée à cet égard parmi nous, end quote. More or less, a fortunate revolution has taken place in this regard among us. So this passage uses revolution as a kind of analogy, a great change or leap forward, similar to the transformation of political arrangements in the revolution that had just unfolded. And this is probably just a metaphor, a way of referring to drastic change, but arguably it might also invoke complex associations connecting the French Revolution with industry and production. And this sort of long-standing association included a kind of secular millennial optimism, the notion that the revolution would rationalize and liberate human creative power. And this is seen famously in the writings of the philosopher Condorcet. And also it was dramatized in a way in the Great Exhibition of 1798, or Exposition des produits de l'industrie française, Exposition of the Products of French Industry. And this was held on the Champ de Mars in the middle of Paris, and it was modeled on a town trade fair, but ramped up to a monumental scale. And this exposition had pavilions showing off products from 110 different artisans, manufacturers, and inventors, and it was intended to spur on innovation in France to compete with the British. But at the same time, this idea of revolution in the realm of industry could also be invoked in a much less grandiose and in more modest and local contexts. So in 1806, the Chamber or City Council of Elbeuf in France used the word revolution basically as a metaphor or analogy for an innovation in a particular trade. And in a report discussing change and progress in the wool industry, they noted that new techniques of spinning and dyeing wool were allowing for much wider ranges of fabrics. And they expressed concern that this new variety then required new regulations. But also, they acknowledged that this innovation had benefits. Quote, "Cette révolution a été utile à l'industrie," or "This revolution has been useful to industry." So here it just refers to a dramatic change like a political revolution, which could be disruptive but could also be beneficial. So this reference is still analogical. It's considering a rapid change in manufacturing as a sort of parallel to the political revolution. And this sense of the word revolution was then taken up and extended dramatically by an influential French writer, Jean-Antoine Chaptal. So Chaptal was a French scientist and the first president of the Society for the Encouragement of National Industry. And in 1819, he published a book simply called De l'Industrie Française on French industry. And this book includes two uses of the word revolution to refer to changes in industry. The first one is when he's discussing new techniques of spinning and dyeing wool, like earlier references we've seen, and how this allowed for a wider range of fabrics. And he writes, quote, "Les machines qui remplacent aujourd'hui la main de l'homme dans presque toutes les opérations de l'industrie manufacturière ont opéré une grande révolution dans les arts," end quote. Which I would translate as the machines that are today replacing the human hand in almost all operations of the manufacturing industry have effected a great revolution in the arts. So note, Chaptal speaks here of a general change caused by mechanization. So revolution in his usage is broad and unbounded in the sense of affecting the arts in general. But at the same time, it's also still narrow. It's a revolution in the arts, not in society in general. And still, this revolution can be seen as parallel or analogous to the revolution in government. Now, secondly, a second time, Chaptal returns to a more familiar and narrow usage of the sense of revolution, specifically in discussing the decline of the linen industry. So Chaptal notes one cause of this decline in linen production as decreasing religious observance and diminished ceremonialism in churches. So the church was a big buyer of linen, but now they're using it less. So in this passage, Chaptal writes, "D'autres causes peuvent encore produire des révolutions dans l'industrie," or roughly translated, "Still other causes can produce revolutions in industry." So both of these occurrences of the word revolution in Chaptal's book are analogical or metaphorical. They're using revolution to mean a dramatic change or leap forward, like the political revolutions. The scope, in one way or another, is limited to a particular sphere of social life, dans l'industrie or dans les arts. Overall, these references seem concerned only with output, in other words, what the industries produce and in what quantities. They are not concerned with the effects on laborers or on the natural landscape or on politics or on society writ large. And this is not surprising given where Chaptal is coming from, because the social impact of new industries in France was still quite limited in this time. France was still predominantly rural and agricultural, and the change to greater industrialism was very gradual. So even as of 1827, and that's 8 years after Chaptal wrote this book, 38% of the population of northern France was engaged in industry, and only 29% of the population in the south of France. And furthermore, this term industry was still used for long-standing rural cottage industries like winemaking. So really, we'd have to say only a small fraction of the population and economy in France were involved in new mechanized industries. Now, in 1827 came the big breakthrough. This is the first known occurrence ever in any language of the exact phrase industrial revolution. And the source is the French magazine Journal des Artistes, which is aimed at artists, the journal for artists. And this magazine ran an article in 1827 which set out to examine, quote, jusqu'à quel point les arts ont pu exercer leur influence dans cette grande révolution industrielle. Or, roughly translated, up to what point the arts could exercise their influence in this great industrial revolution, end quote. So the initial target audience here is artists, and it's asking what role they had to play in the transformations of the day. So there are many levels of importance and significance to this phrase in this article. For one thing, it draws a distinction between arts and industry. And it seems to assume that industry has now spun off from the traditional arts and is now galloping ahead on its own or even out of control. So the question is, what can artists do? What sort of influence can they have on these events that are spinning off on their own? Also, it uses the exact phrase, as we saw, révolution industrielle, industrial revolution. So this seems to be the first known occurrence of this precise phrase, and now it seems to refer to a general transformation or upheaval throughout this entire sphere of industry. And soon after, this article was reprinted in a larger, more wide circulation magazine called Le Moniteur Universel, the Universal Monitor. And the article was printed here with the phrase highlighted in italics, Grande Révolution Industrielle, the Great Industrial Revolution. So this printing seems to suggest that the subject of this article is significant, not just to artists, but to a wider audience. And perhaps then implies that this revolution, this great industrial revolution, is a broader phenomenon affecting all of society. So if you want to pick a single origin point of this concept of industrial revolution, it seems as if maybe we have it here, right? The phrase has appeared. It's appeared more than once. It's been given a place of importance and prominence, right, in italics. But even still, it's not speaking of the myth as we know it today. It's not saying that an industrial revolution has changed society or has marked a great transformation from medieval to modern. And later usages of phrases like this go back. They sort of retreat to more narrow meanings. And the term and concept, it seems, do not catch on or enter into the French language for a long time after. And when it does appear again on occasion, it seems to have that older, more narrow meaning, as applying only to a particular craft. For example, 2 years later in 1829, a merchant and deputy in the National Assembly named Prosper de Launay, who represented the Mayenne, a department on the Loire in the northwest of France, he gave a speech in the National Assembly where he complained about the decline of the linen industry in his department. Right, another theme we've seen before, right? This cataclysmic decline in the linen industry in northern France. And Delaunay, in his speech, complained that the linen industry in his region had been overtaken by cotton manufacturing, maybe from America or from Great Britain, and the land in that area of France had been transferred from growing flax, which was the raw material for linen, over to the growing of sugar beets, a raw material for the new sugar industry. So linen manufacture had basically disappeared from Mayenne over the preceding 20 years, and Delaunay complains that his district has fallen victim to, quote, cette révolution industrielle, this industrial revolution. So Delaunay does use the exact phrase, but only in reference to a specific series of events that changed the economic output of this specific area, and even more to the overthrow of one specific industry in that particular region. And it has been a change in what is produced, not in the conditions of work or life. So this is part of a growing pattern where people in French would refer to any change that they saw as dramatic or disruptive as a revolution. For example, just a few weeks later, in the same year, in the summer of 1829, another deputy in the National Assembly named Pataille was speaking in his capacity representing Bouches-du-Rhône, which is a wine-growing region in the south of France. And Pataille commented on the budget and complained that certain tax provisions would force vineyards to move down from hillsides into river valleys. And he calls this change cette grande révolution. So now it's kind of becoming, you could say that the phrase is maybe being cheapened, right? It's being tossed around now to refer to any kind of economic readjustment. And this pattern was then further amplified by the Revolution of 1830. So this was an actual political revolution that changed the regime in France. But it was also a kind of partial revolution. It did not abolish the monarchy nor establish a republic, but it did change the royal dynasty on the throne, and it introduced some liberalizing reforms. So this new regime was called the bourgeois monarchy. And you can compare this revolution of 1830 in France in many ways to the Glorious Revolution in England, which had brought William and Mary to the throne and also introduced some liberalizing reforms. So basically, this word revolution was now very much in the air in the 1830s in France, and it became a sort of standard term for any change or leap forward, even if it's only partial or limited. And it often was used just as a kind of breathless hyperbole. So there are many examples now from the later 1830s and the 1840s of French writers and politicians referring to particular changes in commerce as revolutions. For instance, the introduction of tea into the European market, the invention of steamships, the discovery of sugar beets, the building of railroads, etc., etc. Some of these are geographically specific changes referring to the rise or fall of a particular craft in a particular region or town, and the term could apply to almost any time period, ranging from the 1600s up to the then present day in the 1830s and 40s. It did not refer to a broad transformation in society as a whole. So this latter notion that an innovation in production or consumption could actually reorder society at large, this idea started to appear very slowly, only after 1830, and only in the most dramatic rhetoric. For instance, in 1835, another deputy in the National Assembly was discussing social change in the country, and he noted that the use of the steam engine in navigation at sea should be expected to cause, quote, une véritable révolution dans les relations sociales, or a veritable revolution in social relations. So this is in line with the traditional dramatic style of French rhetoric, and the use of the modifier veritable indicates that this member of the assembly knew that this was really a figure of speech and an exaggeration, like saying, I am drowning in a veritable ocean of paperwork. And another similar instance from 1 year later came from a more famous author, and this was Alphonse de Lamartine, a socialist politician, writer, and poet who I've actually quoted before from his writings about his travels in Palestine. So in 1836, Lamartine was taking part in a heated debate over tariff policy, And he represented a largely wine-growing district who wanted low tariffs, low trade barriers so that they could export their wine abroad. And he was vehemently opposed to proposals to raise protective tariffs. And he exclaimed, quote, "C'est une révolution toute entière. C'est le 1789 du commerce et de l'industrie." Or, this is a complete revolution. This is the 1789 of commerce and industry. So this quotation is significant in that Lamartine is drawing a more clear, explicit analogy. He is prophesying a dramatic upheaval in the industrial realm that parallels the 1789 revolution in the political realm. But still, it's very important that this prospective revolution is not a transformation in society that has already happened due to technological change. Rather, it is a prospective event that may happen in future as a result of a proposed change in tariff policy. So clearly here, Lamartine with this phrase is not describing the Industrial Revolution as we think of it, but something much narrower and purely hypothetical. Still, nonetheless, it is an instance of a new rising usage of the word revolution to describe some grand transformation in the world out of doors, right, outside of government. So this sense of the word was rising and gaining more popularity in the 1830s, and it seems that it had some spillover from France into Britain. So this is an important forerunner to what we think of as the Industrial Revolution myth. So in 1834, when there's this, great proliferation of the use of the word revolution in French, in 1834, a British liberal statesman named Henry Bulwer published a book on French society called France, Social, Literary, Political. And in this book, Bulwer argues that the true, deeper impact of the French Revolution was not in political restructuring, but rather in its social and psychological effects, which were more profound. And he wrote, quote, "The spirit and intellect of the country received a fresh birth, and at the same time a fresh race was born, a race that had neither the ideas, the wants, nor the history of its predecessors. This was the real revolution," end quote. So Bulwer, in writing this, he almost certainly was influenced by his French sources, right? He practically sounds French here. So his declaration can be seen to reproduce in English the broad idea that there was some deeper revolution around the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, which paralleled the revolution of 1789, but was somehow more sweeping and more profound. Now, Bulwer makes no reference in this passage to industry or manufacturing or anything like that, but probably this idea provided an important forerunner for the concept of the Industrial Revolution in England. But as we see, of course, Bulwer was talking here about France in the wake of 1789, not about Britain, and he was talking about ideas, not about industry. As for the language that he used, this expanded usage of revolution still did not catch on in English until decades later. Nor did it occur to Britons in the 1830s or for decades afterward that they had just witnessed some sort of industrial revolution in their own country. Now finally, I know you've been waiting all this time with bated breath. Finally, in 1848, the first known occurrence of the phrase industrial revolution in English appears in print. And the source was someone you've probably heard of. It was John Stuart Mill in his book, Principles of Political Economy. So in this book, Mill, he's still very early in his career here. He's just venturing into social commentary after working for years as basically a bureaucratic functionary for the British East India Company. But in this book from 1848, Mill uses the term industry extensively. He's concerned a great deal with industry in the sense of manufacturing, and he extensively discusses industrial progress as a kind of continuing evolution and its upsides and downsides. In parts, he condemns the excessive greed and acquisitiveness of British and American businessmen, which in his original draft of the book he calls industrialism. right? So this materialistic obsession with wealth and gain is industrialism. But in a revised draft of the book, he rewrites this phrase and he calls it instead, quote, their devotion to the pursuit of wealth. Now, also, at the same time, in this same book, John Stuart Mill uses the term revolution 49 times. And in some cases, Mill just uses the word in the traditional political sense, like referring to the French Revolution of 1789, or to the revolutions that were just then breaking out across much of Europe in 1848. Sometimes also Mill uses the word metaphorically, like talking about revolutions in the circumstances of a person or a town. For instance, he refers to a revolution in land tenure in Ireland, and he also notes that a so-called revolution had been effected in British agriculture in the late 1700s by the introduction of the turnip. So both of these terms, industry and revolution, occur in a variety of different contexts throughout Mill's book. And just at one single point, they come together. So Mill does use the exact phrase, industrial revolution. And the context is that he is discussing advantages to a country that they can gain from foreign trade and from imports. So Mill argues that sometimes a country is less productive than it could be because the people's desires are modest and easily satisfied. And he says that this is especially true of countries in, quote, an early stage of industrial development, end quote. So Mill says that in this case, when they're in an early stage of industrial development, foreign imports may awaken new desires among the populace or new demand, and hence stimulate people to work harder and become more productive. And he writes, quote, a people may be in a quiescent, indolent, uncultivated state, with all their tastes either fully satisfied or entirely undeveloped, and they may fail to put forth the whole of their productive energies for want of any sufficient object of desire. The opening of a foreign trade, by making them acquainted with new objects, or tempting them by the easier acquisition of things which they had not previously thought attainable, sometimes works a sort of industrial revolution in a country whose resources were previously undeveloped for want of energy and ambition in the people, inducing those who were satisfied with scanty comforts and little work to work harder for the gratification of their new tastes, and even to save and accumulate capital for the still more complete satisfaction of those tastes at a future time. End quote. So you may note that this passage is long-winded, repetitive, and redundant, but still slipped in here into the middle of this run-on sentence is one appearance of the phrase industrial revolution. And here Mill is using the term revolution metaphorically as a figure of speech, clearly set off by the hedging phrase a sort of industrial revolution. And it's important that Mill is using the phrase in a non-specific sense, describing a kind of change in the economy that could happen in any number of places or times. Broadly, in any place that is exposed to foreign imports for the first time, and more specifically an underdeveloped country. So Mill here, if we want to, read his mind a little, he almost surely has in mind the countries overseas in Asia and Africa that were being exposed to European goods for the first time in the 19th century. But still, very importantly, Mill does not link the phrase industrial revolution to any actual specific historical event that purportedly happened in any real named country, much less in England in the late 1700s or early 1800s. As we saw, he's specifically arguing that this sort of industrial revolution is going to happen in an undeveloped country. So this is the remarkable irony of this occurrence of the phrase in Mill's Principles of Political Economy. John Stuart Mill was a philosopher and statesman who was directly involved in trade and empire, working for the British East India Company, and who was specifically concerned with industry, political economy, and social welfare, and he was living and working right in the epicenter of the supposed Industrial Revolution, London, England, in the early 1800s. Yet, in all of his writings, he never mentions that any such revolution even happened. And even in the one instance where he does use the phrase, it's in an abstract sense, in no way connected to events in his own lifetime in England. So why is this? What do we make of this? Maybe Mill was blindingly oblivious. Maybe he had some political motive for avoiding discussion of the Industrial Revolution in England, but he didn't mind being controversial in talking about British life and politics. He was a radical in some respects. And furthermore, Mill was not alone. Everyone else around him in England was also similarly oblivious to this supposed Industrial Revolution. The better explanation is that Mill and other Britons simply did not experience or understand industrial change in the way that we imagine. Living through the early 19th century, they just did not see the growth of industries or cities as a dramatic rupture with the past. And even when they did experience ruptures, they did not fit them into a grand narrative of history in which revolutions form the turning points. That is a way of thinking that even for British dissidents and radicals seemed foreign and vaguely continental, or strongly continental. And really this concept of history was practically unknown in England until at least the 1860s, long after the supposed Industrial Revolution was already complete. Eventually, though, the idea of the Industrial Revolution would catch on in England with a vengeance and would become a deep central part of the English national mythology. So where did they get this new narrative and new terminology from? Well, it was from continental European Romanticism, and it was not so much from France, although it seems that's where the phrase first surfaced. It was not from France, but more from Germany. So although the phrase Industrial Revolution first appeared in writing in French, it was taken up and developed into a serious historical concept by Germans. And Germany was crucial to the creation of this myth. It was Germans who first cast the Industrial Revolution as a kind of double event. On the one hand, it was distinctly British, and on the other hand, it was an epochal moment in human history. And it was from German theorists that Britons first began to hear and adopt the phrase. It was from the German language that it finally entered into English. So why the Germans? Well, Germany was a hotbed of philosophical ferment in the 1800s. It was the cradle of sociology and anthropology and what German philosophers called universal history, meaning basically the construction of a grand unifying narrative of human life. And you may know the main foundational philosopher towering over the intellectual life of Germany in the 1800s was Hegel. So Hegel presented universal history as a dialectic, or a story of repeated conflict and ruptures. And just in brief, there are people who can, discuss Hegel much more competently than I, but just to give my best little amateur summary. In brief, the dialectic holds that each era of history has a guiding idea or belief system, the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. The reigning zeitgeist in time comes to be challenged by its opposite or antithesis, and the mounting struggle between the two worldviews leads in time to a confrontation and conflict until the two ideas are forcibly reconciled into a synthesis. This synthesis then becomes the new orthodoxy, right? The zeitgeist of the new age, until eventually its antithesis arises to challenge it, and the cycle continues. So this dialectical theory of history presents history as progressive, as driven by conflict, and as punctuated by dramatic changes and ruptures with the past. Hence, it is alien, even anathema, to British Whigs. But it provides a framework in which to interpret big events like the French and Haitian revolutions, and that's largely what had inspired Hegel, was witnessing the French and Haitian revolutions. And this dialectical notion of history was taken up by many young German radicals and romantics after Hegel. By the 1830s, there was a strong rising school of thought in the German universities and the intellectual press, which was simply called the Young Hegelians. So this generation of German philosophers, they basically subscribed to the dialectical view of history, but they were skeptical of the notion that events are fundamentally driven by ideas. They were more concerned about class, wealth, and poverty, and they tried to use Hegel's dialectical theory, but to refocus it on material conditions and economics as an engine of history. Possibly the most influential young Hegelian, philosopher who really remained steeped in that movement, possibly the most influential of them was Moses Hess. So Moses Hess came from a Jewish family in Bonn in the Rhineland in Western Germany. But as he grew up, he left the Jewish community and he mingled with the growing international romantic and revolutionary social scene. He dabbled in socialism and in the pantheistic philosophy of Spinoza. In 1837, he published his first book called Die Heilige Geschichte der Menschheit, or basically The Sacred History of Mankind. And he applied the dialectical idea to both religion and political economy. And he argued that history could be divided into 3 ages. And I would say this is very reminiscent to medieval millennialism like Joachim of Fiore. And this must have influenced him, but that's just my guess. But anyway, Hess argued that history could be divided into 3 ages. We love threes. Firstly, the era of the Father. That's the Judaic age, which he cast as a time of community and harmony, where inequality was contained and constrained by periodic jubilees, where property would be broken up and redistributed. This was followed then by the age of the Son, right? Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So then comes the age of the Son, which begins with Jesus Christ. And this was a time of law and private property and of inequality, which Hess saw as exemplified in the Middle Ages. Then there was a coming future third age, which would be the age of the Holy Spirit. And in this age, property would again be abolished. And also in terms of beliefs and spirituality, Judaism and Christianity would be synthesized. Right? So this is like Hegel's dialectic, right? Judaism is the reigning idea, Christianity challenges it, but in the third age of the Holy Spirit, the two would be synthesized into one universal, socialistic, humanitarian faith, which Hess based in Spinoza. And this would then, of course, usher in the New Jerusalem, a sort of Judeo-Christian utopia, you could say. So in 1841, Hess published a second book where he elaborated on exactly how this revolution ushering in the New Jerusalem would come about. So this second book was titled European Triarchy. And here Hess argued that each of the 3 major nations in Western Europe, so that's France, Germany, and Britain, had a special role to play in the coming transformation of mankind. So France had started the political revolution. Germany was the home of the philosophical revolution, which was the revolution of Hegel and the Romantics. And then Britain would lead the way in social and economic change. So Britons, from Hess's viewpoint, looking from the perspective of a German, Britons were tinkerers and shopkeepers. They were practical and pragmatic. They had no great spiritual or philosophical interests. But the wide gulf that was opening up in Britain between the pauperized workers and the so-called aristocracy of wealth, this inequality was creating a class antagonism, like the antagonisms in the Hegelian dialectic. And this would then lead to a rupture and overthrow, ultimately ushering in a socialist economic system. Right? So where politics was revolutionized by the French and philosophical thought by the Germans, the economy would be revolutionized by Britons. Now, this might all sound extremely familiar if you know anything about Marx. And yes, Marx was more or less converted to socialism by Hess. And I think you could argue that Hess was the biggest single influence on Karl Marx. But Marx was not the only young German radical who was deeply influenced by Moses Hess. Another was Marx's friend and supporter, Friedrich Engels. So Friedrich Engels, unlike Hess and Marx, he did not come from a Jewish background. Rather, he came from a devout, pietist Christian family in the German middle class, and Engels' father had a textile manufacturing business. Growing up, Engels grew to hate the German middle class, which he saw as greedy and hypocritical, masking their crass materialism beneath a pietistic front. As a teenager, he published crude poems satirizing the German middle class. Then in 1841, at the age of 21, he went to Berlin. He attended university lectures there, he learned about the young Hegelians, and he met Marx and Hess, who were only a few years older than he was. And Engels became fascinated with Great Britain, which Hess had cast as the homeland of the oncoming economic revolution. In 1842, he finagled a job at the Manchester branch office of his father's textile company, and he sailed for England. Once there in Manchester, Engels could see the working conditions of the textile laborers in the booming city. And he also read very widely in the English pamphlet press, in government reports, and in newspapers like The Guardian and the North Star. And he read about the cramped, dark, unsafe living conditions of the urban workers. He began writing essays and articles about the conditions in England for German periodicals, which were published in Paris and Berlin. In 1844, one article was published in the magazine Vorwärts, based in Paris. And here Engels went back and tried to explain how these conditions that he saw in Manchester had come about in the first place. The article was titled "The Condition of England, the 18th Century." And here Engels argued, quote, "The most important effect of the 18th century for England was the creation of the proletariat by the Industrial Revolution," end quote. And he uses the phrase here, "die industrielle Revolution." So Engels, we have to note here, is not at all an expert in English history, but he is knowledgeable about the condition of the working class there in his time. And he wanted to create a backstory, you could say a myth, for how a population that had previously been engaged in farming and animal herding had now become a kind of herd of animals themselves, dehumanized, penned like livestock into cramped apartment blocks, and marched day after day in and out of factory floors. So he argued that this terrible change had taken place due to a dramatic economic upheaval, an industrial revolution, which had been simultaneous with the French Revolution in government and the German Revolution in thought. So this revolution, which he was positing had happened 50 to 100 years earlier, this was not the kind of revolution that socialists wanted to see. But there was a saving grace. At least this new industrial system had created the new force, the proletariat, which would ultimately destroy the system. And Engels cast this proletariat, this class of workers in England, he cast them as a messianic entity, which would lead the overthrow of wealth and property, leading the way into the socialist age, much like Christ had been held to overthrow the old Judaic covenant for the new. So these articles by Engels had a pretty limited reach. There were only so many German-reading expats in Paris. But in 1845, Engels expanded these arguments and put them into a book in German titled Die Lage der arbeitenden Klasse in England, or The Condition of the Working Class in England. And this book did not appear in English, so it had, hardly any readers in England. Maybe you could count them on one hand. But it caught on dramatically in German, especially among radicals and socialists, and the book seemed to square the circle. It explained how the anticipated final revolution and utopia would come about, and how England would play the crucial final role in it. And this book was especially impactful on Karl Marx, who then picked up the term industrielle Revolution from Engels. And Marx used the phrase repeatedly, most of all in Das Kapital. And the first volume of this massive, magnum opus by Marx was published in 1867. And then the next two volumes were published by Engels after Marx's death in the mid-1880s. So Marx incorporates the idea of the Industrial Revolution into a grand dialectical materialist theory of history. So this posits that the Industrial Revolution, by creating a new class structure defined by antagonism between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, would inevitably lead the way to the final workers' revolution and ultimately to socialism. So by 1870, under the influence of Engels and Marx, this term and concept of industrial revolution had become widespread in German intellectual circles. But all of these works were in German, and they were only occasionally translated into French. They were completely unknown in England. So how did this whole mythic narrative and language finally enter into English? And further, how did people in Great Britain, the country where this revolution had supposedly happened, finally begin to notice that it had taken place and to rework it into a kind of core national myth of England and of Britain more broadly? So we will pick this up hopefully in the next lecture, and then we will also address the ensuing debates about whether this revolution was on balance a good or a bad thing, whether there really was any industrial revolution at all, or if we should drop the whole idea. And if so, then how can we account for the vast differences in technology and economic production in the different parts of the world? So if you want to hear that next lecture, where we will get down to the canonization and then the questioning and deconstruction of the myth of the Industrial Revolution, then please sign up as a patron at any level. And finally, as I said, in conclusion, this lecture was brought to you by the state of California. So I'd like to thank my current active patrons in California, including Nina Amenta, Monroe Labuis, Enzo Dominguez, Dan Hernandez, Sparky Abraham, Adam Kath, and Christine Lacaire Pacheco. Thank you.